My name is Jorb, and I love gear. This is the Hydrasynth Explorer from ASM, a digital synth with a whole lot of amazing sound design tools that all do deserve attention and respect, but this video is going to be focused on what I consider to be its defining feature, oscillator mutants. Oscillator mutants are sort of effects, sort of synthesis parameters that do a lot of things, but what they all do is affect the oscillators in useful, unique ways. And although they're all inspired by, or at least can be related back to, classic synthesis ideas on some level, they all take those ideas farther than anything else I can think of. Certainly in the hardware realm, and that is accomplished by taking advantage of the Hydrasynth's proudly digital architecture. It's no secret that a lot of these mutants are only capable in a synth that's digital and doesn't care if you know that it's digital. So I'm going to step through each of them and give you sort of explanation of how they work, how to control them, and I'm going to be aided by the oscilloscope visuals here, and if I need to turn on my own oscilloscope, I will certainly do that. Many of these sounds will become, I guess, intense. They'll become intense if you just turn up the values, and that doesn't really work for me when I do sound design. I need to understand what I'm changing, so I spent some time to really comprehend what it is that's happening when I move any of these knobs. When I'm controlling any of these mutants, I'll do the best to close some of the gap for you guys too. Cool. I've been told that the algorithm and people's brains like it when you see my face. So there's my face, even though I'm not going to change the camera angle for this video at all. And I've been told that if I ask you guys to subscribe, you'll do it more. So please subscribe. Helps me grow. There you go. That's all the shilling. I won't even mention the fact that I have affiliate links to Perfect Circuit or Reverb in the description. And I won't mention that I can get a kickback no matter what you buy. But no more shilling, huh? I'm going to initialize this patch. And if we look in the mixer, we can see we're just on oscillator 1, and oscillator 1 is just on a sawtooth. I'm going to go through them in what I consider to be relative complexity. So I'm going to start with wave stacking. So there's a few things we'll see on a lot of the mutants, a dry-wet blend and a depth. And the dry-wet blend, dry is just your source oscillator, wet is just the result of whatever's happening in the mutant, as we would expect. So a lot of the time I'm going to be on 100%. And so wave stacking. Let's start with depth at 0. There's our sawtooth as it is coming in. And even as I blend to 100% wet, we can hear it's a little different. And what this depth will do for wave stacking is just detune. And so wave stacking gives you 5 copies of your initial oscillator. And let me read I have the manual right here to help me. Can you believe it that I'm this planned ahead? It says, stacks 5 detuned copies of the waveform on top of itself. What I'm not sure about is if we're at 100% dry, there's our input wave. I'm not sure if that wave persists all the way to 100% wet. If we're at 50-50, is it the dry and 5 copies, so we have 6 sounds? Doesn't really matter. This is just how you get your super saw. You want it to be big and shifting. There's full detune. Great, and I choose WaveStack for a few reasons. It begins a few trends. Number one, depth doesn't really mean anything, and it changes for all the mutants, and I think that's kind of a misstep. That could be detuned, and I would really immediately understand more of what it was doing. And it begins the trend of mutants taking on the roles that in a traditionally architectured synthesizer would take a lot more oscillators, at least 2, and in this case, 6 or 5, depending on what I do or don't know. So that's really all I need to show you with that. And of course, you have the rest of your synthesis parameters, and this oscillator does not have to be, doesn't even have to be simple wave. It can be our scanned waves, and we can edit our wave list. Get out of there, get out of there, go back in oscillator 1. So everything that we can change within the oscillators, that can get fed into the mutants, no matter how complicated or how simple it is. Cool. I believe I've made my point. Let's get back to our mutant here. And we'll get back to single sawtooth. Hear it one more time in the way most people are probably going to use it for doing super saw stuff. Wonderful. And that is really all I want to show you with wave stacking. So let's move on. Again, we're going out of order. Sorry, I got to make sure I use my left hand. To harmonic. And I think harmonic is also pretty easy to understand. Alrighty. We are at 0% on our dry wet mix, so we're just hearing the input oscillator, which is back to just a sawtooth. And harmonic lets you accentuate specific harmonics. So let's start by just going to 100% wet. Great. And so we're just hearing what's happening in the mutant. And right now, turn ratio down. Hardly hear anything. I doubt you'll hear it, especially if you're watching on a phone. As I turn ratio up, sounds like a resonant filter, right? A resonant bandpass. I'm going to turn up depth as well. Shit, I got to use my left hand. Okay, just like a resonant filter. So what are depth and ratio doing? As defined by the manual here, it tells us that depth controls the harmonic range and ratio selects the emphasis harmonic. Okay? And maybe I just am describing these things in the wrong way, but I think of this just like a variable EQ. And maybe if I've got a spectrum analyzer on screen, it'll be much clearer, right? But ratio is described as initial harmonic emphasis. Feels like we're changing the frequency of that resonant filter to me. And depth is described as our harmonic range. Feels sort of like the width of our emphasis. And it almost feels like it's going up and not like bipolar, going up and down. But I really don't know. It almost feels to me like you define a frequency with your ratio here, and then your depth increases out that way. Is that a good visual? If the spectrum analyzer confirms that, I'm going to feel like a big brain. Cool. And like all of these, we have our dry-wet blend. And of course, they can be modulated by anything else. And it doesn't take up what might normally take up one of your two filters to get an effect like that. Wonderful. Harmonic is also the start of a lot of these mutants having a feedback control. And that is exactly what it sounds like. The output of the mutant gets put back in to the input of the mutant. Just like if you had a synthesizer with a headphone out and you ran that into the audio in. You're running the signal back on itself. That can result in some really, really outlandish sound. If we're at 100% dry, if we're at 100% wet, the feedback on this just seems to sort of reduce its effect. I don't know if that's due to my specific settings or what, but it's not on here because it pairs particularly well with harmonic. It's on here because a lot of the mutants have that option. Whoops, because it's something that is definitely plausible within the Hydrasynth engine. And you know what? That sort of feels like the inception for a lot of these things is, hey, we have this data on these oscillators. We know, certain things about them. How can we manipulate those with other things? And I think that is kind of where all the mutants came from. And you can do things that you couldn't normally do a wavetable architecture like this, where a wave stack, you just crossfade between individual single cycles. You get access to a lot of these mutants because they seem to have sat down and said, okay, we have this data, we know these points of information about the oscillators at a given time. How can we manipulate those? And I think it's really interesting what they managed to come up with. Okay, that is it for harmonic as well. I'm going to change to one of my favorites, which is the phase difference. I do have one question about it, though. We'll get there in a second. So this is the only page. Okay, there's our dry sound. Here's our wet sound. We latch that. We can increase our depth. Okay, so we have our input wave as a sawtooth. When I go to 100% wet, it's a perfectly variable pulse width on a square, which is weird and interesting, especially knowing what we know about dry-wet. I think this is actually just a blend at 100%. I think at 100% it's 50-50, unless I misunderstand how this mutant works, and the mutant always has our input oscillator in this one, which does not stay in line with the rest of the ones we've seen, but let me use a different oscillator to sort of demonstrate. So we're going to use this really, really short pulse, okay? So let me go to, we're at 0% on our mix. Okay, so 0% of our mutant. So we can't hear our mutant at all, just our input oscillator, just our source oscillator. And our depth is full, and depth here, and our depth is full, and I'm going to change our dry-wet mix. Okay, so at depth 128, we hear nothing. Let's go down to 0. We hear very little change on both those, I should say. And then as I move the depth, there's our visual of what's happening. We have an inverted copy of our first oscillator being mixed in, and depth lets us control its relative phase. I think I might, in fact, turn on my own oscilloscope for this, because it might be a little bit easier to see. Okay, so you can see on my oscilloscope, there's our initial, and as I change our depth, we see it separating, and we can see that it's inverted. Okay, so notice which side is tall and which side is short on our dry signal. As I pull in wet, notice which one's taller and which one's shorter. So we can see that it's inverted, and it almost totally cancels out at our full depth in either way, because the relative phase is either all the way at the beginning or all the way at the start of the wave. But we could put it somewhere near the middle and get the same sort of effect we would have if we had two single-cycle oscillators that were very close in pitch, just barely changing in pitch. And now we can directly affect that beat frequency by changing this depth with an LFO or an envelope. So we have finer and more specific control of a sound result or an effect that is certainly possible in a traditionally architectured synthesizer. But like I said, we have very fine control over here. Cool. Okay, I'm going to go back to... Okay, and back to our saw. Why does this give us a square? Let's try and understand why we get a square with the sawtooth. Well, we saw with our really short pulse that it was inverted, right? Let's visualize that same thing here, and this is why I'm suspicious of the labeling of dry-wet. This is also why I'm suspicious of the dry-wet labeling. There's our sawtooth, just filtered a little bit. And at 0, or at 128, we're totally canceled, right? So we have that same triangle inverted, add it back to itself, so it pretty much totally cancels out. And as I change the depth now, where those triangles, those inverted triangles cross, right? So at full, turn down our depth here. Turn down our mix here. So I don't think this lets us just flip the phase of our oscillator. I think our dry-wet always includes our dry signal, which is a little bit frustrating. But let's listen to feedback on it while we're here. insane. I described them as intense earlier. And I encourage you to use feedback very, very responsibly. But know that you can get some really wacky results out of it. Cool. I think that's all for phase difference. Let's move on. They start to get a little complicated. I'm really trying to not use my right hand. I'm so sorry. Alrighty. Oscillator Sync. This is where they start to really, really branch out and become something more. So here's just the sawtooth. And if you know Oscillator Sync as it is, there has to be a source, right? So the oscillator connected to this mutant, we're going to call it the follower. And our source is going to be the source. So let's make oscillator 2 our source and just go back up. And hear what we hear. Go to full wet, not very many changes. But as I change the pitch here, and this is oscillator 2, we're listening to oscillator 1 only because it's nothing from 2 is coming into our mixer. Okay? And as I change the pitch, that's how often we'll reset the wave of oscillator 1, the only audible one. Okay, so here, as I go up a little bit, think of what's happening. If the pitch of oscillator 2 is higher, relatively, than the pitch of oscillator 1, we're going to reset the sawtooth more often. And we're going to hear the pitch of oscillator 2, but hear the timbre as affected in oscillator 1. And so somewhere we have 5 semitones now. And think about what's happening. We're resetting our sawtooth more often than we want to, so the shape isn't perfect anymore. Let's go to another shape. Pulse width 2. And this is a good example. So here oscillator 1 is on pulse 2, right? And that's its entire cycle. That's the whole cycle of it. That's the whole cycle of that waveform. And if I change the pitch here of oscillator 2 so that it's happening before we get to that first jump of oscillator 1, we won't hear anything, right? Because we're resetting it faster than that wave is completing its cycle. So it's getting shorter. And only 5 semitones up, we don't hear anything. So the effect between oscillator 1's wave and the pitch of oscillator 2, and I think in this implementation, the wave of oscillator 2, yeah, does not make any difference at all. So, really here, oscillator sync is implemented in a way that it's let's play with how often we reset our following wave, our oscillator 1, because I'm using mutant 1 wave. So let's listen to what happens when I have a triangle. So here is a triangle. I'm going to reset it more often. Sounds like a sawtooth, right? Because we're resetting it halfway through the triangle. And we reset it halfway through the triangle, we've only heard the first half. And the first half sounds kind of like a sawtooth, doesn't it? Cool. You get some weird interactions if you go lower. This is also where you start to notice the mutants behave a little strangely. So if I hold a note and change, and then press it again, it behaves differently. Hear that? Listen to that. As I press a new note, it sounds different. I don't know exactly what that is or how to explain it, but... And I don't have random phase on, yeah. I think random phase would affect the way this works, actually. Let's just look. Seems to, so let's leave that off. And that makes sense. that random phase would change the way this sounds, because random phase will change for oscillator 1, it's the one we can hear, where in that wave it's starting. And so the timbre that we're modifying isn't consistent per note. So let's turn that back off. And we will go back to Mutant 1. So that's sort of traditional oscillator sync, how it would work if we didn't have any of our additional options, right? And so we then get a lot more craziness and ratio, increasing the number of times per cycle that you reset your wave. So what you hear is very closely related, or in fact essentially the same thing, as if you were changing the pitch of oscillator 2. The only difference is, now you do not have to change the pitch of oscillator 2, and it's something you can control from within the mutant. And it has that same sort of strange behavior where it'll change when you reset your note here. Maybe that's a result of where in the wave it's at when I change the knob or change the pitch. So we're going to go back to a sawtooth. So we have some more consistent harmonics to play with. Ratio is really a multiplication of the pitch of oscillator 2 to reset oscillator 1. So if we're right at 1, I think if I hold shift, yep, it's resetting, and I believe, let's get back to 0 here. So right now, it's as if it's resetting exactly as often as it should, or exactly as often as it's set to within here, which is in tune with consideration to the note we're playing. So here we go again, ratio. So pretty much we're getting the same thing we get when we change pitch of oscillator 2, which is wonderful, because now we can have this source be pretty much whatever and change the ratio here to get whatever quality of sound or sync sounds we want without having to change the settings of our source oscillator or oscillator 2 to get around that. And that leaves them free to be their own sound in a mixer. Wonderful. Let's talk about what depth does. And this is another example of depth not meaning anything. It says, and I quote, controls strength of sync effect. What the hell does that mean? Is it resetting the oscillator or not? I don't understand what strength could mean. What depth sounds like it's doing to me is not like ratio. Depth is as if we're changing the pitch of oscillator 1. Okay, so I've moved it up and I'll show you. Now we're on 1, oscillator 1 and 2 have the same settings, and depth is at 0. But as I change the pitch of oscillator 1, I want my oscilloscope to show up. Okay, back to our mutant. This is a finer, smoother control. But seems to be doing the same thing. Cool. Does that sort of help? So ratio is like your fake changing your pitch of oscillator 2. Depth is like your fake changing your pitch of oscillator 1. Again, I don't like these naming conventions. I don't think they're helpful in understanding what's going on. And this might be the first time that I think the Hydrasynth manual is kind of lacking. Okay? And here's the second time. What the f*** is a window? I think it's a smoothing algorithm. I Googled it. There's some math shit. So I refer to the manual. The manual says applies Hahn window. Okay, what is a window? Hahn window applies a bell curve filter to the oscillator sync source. It rolls off the high and low input frequencies at 18 dB per octave, which can help tame any harshness in the output. It doesn't make any sense that it's changing the sync source to me, because the sync source seems to just take the pitch of oscillator 2, no consideration to its actual wave. And if that's the case, why does it matter if that's smooth or not? And so I think that just leads to more confusion. Let's look at what it's doing. Makes our output smoother. Okay, I don't know if I'm misunderstanding things here, or if it just becomes quite abstract. Right, but I think really all we're doing is smoothing our output. I don't know that has anything to do with the source in this case. Anyway, all that to say, what an incredible amount of wave shaping we have here, and I haven't even done feedback for this oscillator. And this has all been with single cycle waveforms. So really the options here are insane, and it quickly becomes not oscillator sync. But that is a good way to name it, because that's where these principles start, and that's what you can expand from if you already do understand. So there you go. There's the first few failings, in my eyes, of the Hydrasynth manual. Depth has never meant anything for these, so I'm frustrated by them. So I'm going to summarize, because I feel like I said a lot of shit. So your source is just the beginning of how often you're going to reset your wave, right? So you can set it to whatever the hell you want, and then you really change it with ratio or depth. Ratio has the same effect as changing your source oscillator. Depth, to my ears, maybe I'm wrong, has the same effect as changing the pitch or the frequency of your following oscillator. So it might be a good idea to leave oscillator 2 with its powerful mutants available not as the source, and just use oscillator 3 and never pull it up in the mixer or never manipulate its pitch. You can have it do whatever you want and be set to whatever you want, but don't manipulate its pitch over the course of a wave or with an LFO unless you're ready for that to change the sound of your first oscillator or whatever mutated oscillator you're syncing. Okay? And our window smooths our output. Cool. All that to say, this is another trick that takes advantage of how digital this synth is. It doesn't care if traditional oscillator sync could not have a depth or a ratio like that, as far as I understand it. It would be resetting as often as its source. And with the Hydrasynth's implementation here, you can decouple the behavior as if you were changing the source and decouple the behavior as if you were changing the follower. And then smooth it all out without wasting one of your filters. Wonderfully flexible. Really, really impressive. Damn, that was a long one. You guys ready? I'm going to teach you a little bit of FM. Isn't that insane? I'm going to change our first oscillator to a sine. Because that's what I think of when I think of FM. I'm going to change our ratio to 1. Increase our dry wet. Alrighty. So, if you guys don't know FM, this is just going to sort of be the short Jorb FM primer with the inclusion of specific controls here available in the Hydrasynth. So the first thing I'm going to do is we are on 100% wet. Our source is a sine. I'm going to increase our depth. Okay, so that's sort of FM sounds, sort of how we get there. But let's understand what we're doing. If I turn ratio way down, and we change our source to oscillator 3, and our oscillator 3 is now tuned 3 octaves down, plus whatever that is in cents. We go to oscillator 1. Let's change it up 3 octaves. Okay, hearing some weird stuff. Let's change our depth, just barely. We're going to change the wave here of our oscillator 3 to a sine. We can sort of hear something, right? That's just an LFO on our pitch, isn't it? Because right now, the note I'm playing, oscillator 3, is 3 octaves down. Oscillator 1 is 3 octaves up. And the ratio is 1/4. So for every 4 times our oscillator 3 cycles, it's changing our oscillator 1. But in effect, what you're hearing is I will slow down an audible oscillator until it's closer in speed to something like an LFO. And changing depth just lets us hear pitch modulation. Okay, and if you noticed, I had to change the wave to keep it smooth, because unlike our oscillator sync, FM does have consideration to the actual output of its source. In any other implementation of FM, we would need something oscillating, an oscillator in many cases, or we call them operators in properly digital FM. But let's go back up and change our source to just a sine wave. And so that sine wave, its only pitch is the one you define here in the ratio, the relative ratio. And just like I had to change the wave shape on our third oscillator, if I go from sine to triangle, we hear a difference. Those are the only pre-built sources, and we can point it to the output of any oscillator, ring mod, and noise, or any mutant. Great. So really, the FM implementation is very flexible, surprisingly flexible, and just sort of has settings that exist within the mutants, because that's the only place they could be. So the depth is just like the amount of an LFO to your pitch, but since it's happening at audio rates, and the audio rates at ratio 1 are related, it sounds pretty pleasant. We just make really harmonically complex waves, right? But as I change the ratio to inharmonic ones, things get really, really complicated the higher you get. Let me latch this. If you hold shift, you go in even ratios, which is what something like the digitone does in some settings in the Op6. They keep you to harmonic ratios. And I'm really just going through potential FM sounds. Cool, there's your FM primer. I'm not going to go into that much more detail, but I will tell you, you can use your envelope to control these ratios or these depths, and your LFOs to control these ratios and these depths. So I'm going to turn off the cameras, try and make a somewhat traditional FM electric piano, and we'll jump back and see if I did a good job. Just to show you that if you want to take the time to learn FM properly, more than I have demonstrated to you, there are some really, really powerful options. Okay, here's a very simple FM sort of e-piano patch, which does everything with just this second envelope, because it's going to the amp, and we are hearing both oscillators. Oscillator 1 has a mutant of FM linear. Oscillator 3 and 4 also have FM linear. And in the mod matrix, envelope 2 is controlling the depth of mutant 1, mutant 3, and a little bit of mutant 4. If I turn on a little bit of delay, a little bit of reverb, less reverb, cool. We get a little bit of FM with no shortage of options that you would expect from something like a proper FM synthesizer, just with a little bit different names, a little bit different routing. So with some algorithmic restrictions, you have 7 operators, and I'm sure the LFOs and the envelopes are accurate enough to stay in pitch and key track as well. So really, you have, 12, not counting the envelopes if you want them to cycle. You have 12 operators. Any of these can be sources or destinations. And because the LFOs are available in the mod matrix with some algorithmic restrictions, you have a pretty complete FM suite here. So I won't make any more bold FM claims. I'm no expert. But I like the simple FM stuff that I can crank out here in a few minutes. And there you go. We've got another reason why The Hydrasynth can do fucking everything. So, initialized. Way too low. Still low. Okay, back to picking a mutant here. We have 3 pulse width modes, and they all behave a little differently. And because it's pulse width, why don't I give us a square? So we hear the things we expect here, huh? Alrighty. Change our wet to 100%. Change our depth. Wonderful. Does what it says on the tin, huh? But this sounds exactly the way you'd think it would. And on the original, the implementation is the middle of the waveform stays fixed, and we compress or expand the edges. Changes over to the oscilloscope. The center stays fixed, and as I go into our mutant and change depth, we compress the edges. But we can do that on any wave shape, which is sort of interesting. Okay, and now let's think about why this looks the way it does. The center of our wave shape. I thought it would be here. It seems to be halfway through this cycle. Right, so halfway through our sawtooth. As I go back to our mutant and change depth, that stays where it's at, and we sort of squish the insides together. Cool. That gives us some wonderful, wonderful options. Ratio, which we've learned about in some other things. How often during a single cycle we're going to trigger whatever it is. In this case, it's pulse width. In this case, it's pulse width. So let's do 1/4. And so you're seeing that center as defined as 1/4 as often as it was before. So every 4 times it cycles. We turn it way up high. The effect is sort of a bit reduction on a sawtooth. Giving us a step wave, just like the Korg EX800. I think that would quite literally be ratio 4. Yeah, wow, that's really cool. I'm super geeky about the Korg EX800 oscillator. You should look it up. But its sawtooth is 4 squares of different octaves with descending volumes, which is exactly what we're seeing here. Back to our dry, just to remember what it sounds like. If we get really, really high resolution, not much change at all. Certainly what we're seeing, but a little bit what we're hearing. Okay, and because you're getting it 64 times in a cycle, you have that sort of perceived pitch of downsampling, as if you have a Nyquist frequency. Wonderful. Cool. Very interesting. And it makes sense at a high depth and a high ratio, where the ratio means this is happening, these changes to the wave is happening this many times per cycle. So 64 times a cycle. Gives us that sort of Nyquist, that downsampling sound. And when we have the depth so high, it's pretty much flat if our ratio's on 1. Pretty much flat, right? So if we make 15 slices of our wave, almost totally flat, or even less, Looks like we have low resolutions of whatever our input wave is, which again, doesn't have to be a sawtooth. It could be anything. Is the Hydrasynth the ultimate chiptune synthesizer? Anyway, that could have been the focus of a whole video. Cool. There's original. And just one more time, let's get back to a boring wave. So you can see it picks that middle of the sawtooth, makes it flat, and sort of compresses everything else. Right, so all the change we had in half of a cycle, that's getting brought up just to the very, very end. Like a much smaller portion of our wave, a much smaller period of time is when that entire vertical change is happening. Cool, interesting. I don't know that I would think that's how vintage pulse width worked. I don't know that that's how I understand it as getting fixed in the middle of the cycle. As demonstrated here in the middle of the sawtooth, I would have thought that the trailing edge here, right, the one like 100% vertical side of the square, I would have imagined that would squish in. And if this is more bitching, I'm going to complain again, if our phase changing, our phase differential mutant was actually 100% wet, and I could just shift the relative phase of a wave, if I stacked this original pulse width after a phase change that worked the way I would like it to, and I could just have that effect. I could just take that trailing edge and push it in or out. Anyway, no more complaining. Do we have feedback? Yes, we do. Again, not paired because you're going to get any particularly fitting sounds, or it's a control that suits this in one way or another, just because that's something they realized they could do with Mutants. Cool. Let us move on to the next sort of pulse width squeeze. And straight from the manual, this form of pulse width modulation grabs the start and end points of the modulation and then squeezes them to the right. Might help to think of this as time warping a waveform. Makes the oscillator go slow at first and then go fast, all in the space of a single cycle. Let's get our ratio to 1. So we're doing this action of our pulse width once every cycle. Just from that one sentence, think of the oscillator as going fast and then going slow, all within the span of a single cycle. So what does that look like for our sawtooth? Well, if we go faster, if we're a higher pitch, a higher frequency, our slope is going to be more dramatic. So that's that first part there. And going slow means our slope will be more gradual. But just like the last one, that sort of middle of our change seems to be the middle of our ramping here. Very, very interesting. Let's turn up the ratio. Let's just make it to 3 times in a given wave. It's like we're seeing that stepped wave again. Why? Because we're doing this pulse width action 3 times. Our ratio is 3 in a given cycle of our input wave. Let's make it 4 again. I don't really understand why we're getting... Again, it changes when you move it and then press the key. I don't really understand that final bit slapping up there in the depth. It's almost like where we consider the start or the end of the wave isn't exactly the start or the end of the wave. But no harm, no foul. Let's get our ratio back to 1, sort of expected. Another really powerful wave shaping tool. Helps me to understand it. But this one still feels, the results still feel a little bit abstracted from what we're changing here. But right there, cool. There you go. Another very clever implementation of pulse width. I don't know that it's fair in many ways to call these other ones pulse width, but I think they did well in choosing that because that's where your understanding of it begins, is something that's sort of expected or traditional. But one last time, the beginning speeds up and the second half slows down. So we have, for a sawtooth, a more dramatic slope and then a more gradual slope. Let's pick some wackier wave just to hear it. And at high depths, it sounds like very high pulse width or very low pulse width. A very, very powerful thing to modulate. Okay, let us change to the next one. And somehow, the wackiest. Pulse width ASM. They call it warp as well in the manual. Let's read. Divides the selected waveform into 8 sections that are framed by warp points. The values for each chosen warp point determine how warped each section of the waveform can become. And so to refer back to our last one, our last form, squeeze, if squeeze wasn't just let's pick the middle and speed up the beginning and slow down the end, let's give us 8 sections, 8 points, where we can change the relative speed, right, or how fast, or so we can change how fast we're playing that section of that wave. Okay, so let's go back to sawtooth, something we know, and I'm going to go down to page 2 here at custom edit. I'm going to latch that, filter it a little bit so it isn't so grating, and I'm going to change these different warp points. Oops, I am at no depth. So here's 64 depth. You can already see some changing. Back to our warp edits. Okay, so our first section is going to go up here. Can you see that when I do that? Let's do this. So our first warp section. So really dramatic amounts. We have like an isolated waveform happening within the cycle of our source wave. And there, it looks a little bit like that speeding up and slowing down. But as you go on, it's like that wave is getting repeated. It's like budding. It's like a growth. Let's go back. And I think sawtooth might be a good place to show this. Yeah, a really, really low sawtooth. As I turn up this 8 section, we're getting more repetitions of the cycle of a sine wave in that 8th section, that 8th span of time. And you can change each of those sections independently. And if we have them all on full, it's like there's no change. As soon as one is different, it's how relatively different it is, then suddenly we get some dramatic changes. And that's sort of where my understanding of it falls apart a little bit. And they write this in the descriptions. Pulse width ASM mode is a form of FM. It allows you to draw your own modulator waveform by selecting different values for each of the 8 warp points. Construct a slope, a valley, a mound, jagged peaks, pseudo-random, etc. Your design will become an FM source. And knowing that reinforces how I described it, right? That an individual section speeds up or slows down the wave, right? We're just providing FM or having FM in this given place. But how does that explain when they're all at 128 why that stops? I am going to tell you that I don't fully understand this, but I can tell you that sort of like the pulse width squeeze mode, you can change things within a certain region, and it seems to be related, and it seems to kind of be like squeeze in that you're speeding up or slowing down the rate of an individual wave. But there clearly is some interaction between the warp points that I don't understand, because as soon as they all get to 128, why would that cancel out? You can point the mod matrix to these warp points, these warp zones individually. This sort of becomes a very... So, you can think of it as zoned FM. You can think of it like Pulse Width Squeeze got a PhD. Or you can think of it as a wholeheartedly more complicated way to manipulate FM. And I think this falls into the trap. This falls into the trap for me of I don't understand it well enough to ever want to refer to it. If you just want to make wacky, intense sounds, it's a great choice. But if, like me, you want to do your best to understand what you're changing, I fall a little bit short on this one. Mostly the relationship between the warps, so... Alrighty, there you go. There's a good, quick look at all the mutants. Sorry if I let you down on PWASM, but I think you have a functional understanding of what is going to change with sounds, whether I understand the theory behind why full depth on all 8 steps gives you your original wave again. So anyway, my name's been Jorb. I love gear. Hope you learned something. Comment if you did. Comment if you didn't. Don't be mean, though. I'm kind of getting over that. Thanks for watching. Subscribe. See you in the next one. So long. Bye-bye.